The mystery of the Eucharist. Let's speak a little bit about the mystery of the Eucharist. One of the important teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, this is one of the fundamental, teaching of the Catholic Church, which is at the heart of the celebration of the Catholic liturgy. But what is the Eucharist? As a mystery, it can be understood from several perspectives. But let me begin with one of the very important perspectives, which oftentimes we do not, we do not recall, or we do not remember very too often. And that is the fact that the Eucharist is the gift. It's a gift. The gift of all gifts. Why is it a gift? In the Most Holy Eucharist, our Lord Jesus Christ gives himself wholly to us, completely. He gives himself as love. Love has the nature of giving, and he gives himself completely, totally in the gift of the Holy Eucharist. And so the first way of understanding the Eucharist is understanding it from the perspective of the gift of love, in which he gives himself totally to us. And that is why we link the Eucharist to the cross, because on the cross, Christ gave himself completely, totally. And so the Eucharist is first of all a gift of love. But there are other dimensions of understanding the Eucharist, because when we ask, but why bread? Why bread? Why did he give himself to us as bread? Because in the Most Holy Eucharist, we see Christ in the form of bread and wine. So he gives himself to us as love, but in the form of bread and wine. But why bread and wine? Now, here we go back to a little bit to the cultural context. In the cultural context, the Mediterranean context in which Jesus Christ lived, bread was the most fundamental or the most basic element of life. So bread was, you might say, equivalent to life. And so, when he gives himself as bread, it's a symbolic way of saying that he's giving us his life. And so it's a gift of love, it's a gift of life. And so precisely that's why Jesus will say, I am the bread of life. So in the Eucharist, we see Christ as a gift of love and as a gift of life. But then even more, beyond seeing the Eucharist as a gift, the ultimate gift, the gift of all gifts, and it's in response to Jesus who gives himself as gift that we celebrate it as a thanksgiving. And that's where the name derives, Eucharistia, thanksgiving. Because the response to a gift is thanksgiving. When you're giving something precious, the expected response is thanksgiving. And so that is why we Christians call the Eucharist as a thanksgiving, as a Eucharistia, thanksgiving, in recognition, in appreciation of Christ who gives himself completely and totally. But it's not just, we don't just understand the Eucharist as thanksgiving, but we also celebrate it as a what? As a memorial. We remember, as an anamnesis. That's the right word, the anamnesis. Why? Because we recall. So each time we gather to celebrate in thanksgiving for this gift of love, we recall, we remember this gracious gift. And so you see the connection. So it's a thanksgiving. We gather in anamnesis, in remembrance of this gift. So they're all connected. So you see Christ as the Eucharist as a gift of love, which leads us to, and a gift of life, which leads us to offer thanksgiving to God for these gifts. And so, in order to remain ever grateful to God, we have to keep remembering anamnesis, we recall. And that is why the liturgy is crucial, is important, because we need to recall. When one forgets, one becomes ungrateful. But you see, there's another dimension to the Eucharist, the fact that it is a sacrifice. You know, the primitive name for the Eucharist is breaking of bread. The breaking of bread. You know, the cross is the breaking of bread. But that gesture of breaking has a significance. When you break, it's a form of death. It's a form of death. It's a sacrifice. And that is what, you know, at the cross, Jesus did. So you might say that on the cross, Jesus broke himself. He died. When something is broken, it's more like it's destroyed. It's dead. And so that is the significance, or that is why the early Christians called it the breaking of bread, in a way to recall Christ, who gives himself wholly, gives his life completely for us. And so, as those who receive this gift of love, this gift of life, we gather to remember this gift. And that is why we call it an anamnesis, a remembrance. And then we gather in thanksgiving, in worship to God. But how is this connected with marriage? You know, in marriage, two people give themselves completely, wholly. And so every marriage has a Eucharistic dimension. Because in marriage, a couple decides to give themselves wholly, totally to each other. And when you give yourself to other, it's a form of death. You die so that the other will live. And that is the sacrificial dimension of marriage. Each partner must be willing to break himself or herself for the other. And so marriage, entails each partner having to literally break himself or herself, because it's a form of death. You have to die, so that life may flow from that. And it's important also to recall the aspect of remembering. Oftentimes in marriage, people forget, and just like I said that the Eucharist has the dimension of anamnesis, remembrance, recalling. But it's not just a remembering of something that is past and gone, but it's something that is present. And so it requires that in marriage, that couples always keep in mind what is where they began. Because when you forget where you started, how you started, the love that brought you together, when you forget, then things begin to go wrong. Just like when Christians forget this gift of love, then they begin to turn away from God. So when couples forget, they begin to turn away from each other. And so marriage is Eucharistic, and that is why it's a sacrament in the church. And that is why, usually, the marriage is celebrated within the context of the Holy Eucharist. It's true that it does not necessarily have to be so, but most marriages, are usually celebrated in the context of the Eucharist as a way of also, helping couples to remember that their marriage is Eucharistic. It must be a gift of love, a gift of life. It must be one in which they are willing to die and sacrifice for each other. It is one in which they must ever remain thankful to each other. Thankful. And finally, it must be one that they must always be willing to die for each other. Thank you.